ready to go over here? Okay. Everybody ready to go? Let's get started tonight. Genesis 32 through 34. So thanks for coming out. Let's say a prayer real quick before we start our study. God, we thank you for your word, and thank you for your salvation and your grace. And as we learn tonight about the reconciliation of Esau and Jacob, we pray that we would remember the importance of applying grace to every area of our life and with our relationships with others. Amen. Okay. Any questions? Any comments about my prayer? No? Okay. If not, you guys going to class tonight? I think he's back there waiting for you all. Turn to Genesis 32. Hi. Okay, I'm going to change my tie now. Genesis 32. Last week we left off in chapter 31, covering 3 chapters where Jacob has his wives, he's got his children, he's got his wealth, his flock, and he leaves Laban. In chapter 31, God told him to go back to the land, and so he heads back. Laban catches up with him, trying to get him to come back to work for him again. Of course, God appears to Laban to ensure Jacob has safe passage back to the promised land, and they end up separating. They make a covenant, they build an altar, or not an altar, but a pillar, and they agree not to cross back into each other's lands. This is it. So that's all we hear from Laban. Chapter 32, he's in that area when he has the unction to reconcile with Esau, which is part of what's going to happen. Remember, the reason why he left the land was because Esau hated him. And so it's because of his deception of Esau and usurping of the blessing from the father that the parents sent Jacob away, and now Jacob's coming back. And so one of the things on his mind is, what about my brother? He said he hated me. He said he was going to kill me. That's why I left. So what's going to happen? Of course, God has promised Jacob multiple times, Genesis 28 and Genesis 31, that he will protect him. And he even said in chapter 31 when he took him back that I will be with you. Remember the vow that Jacob made and said, if God will keep me, will protect me, then he'll be my God. And so there's been this promise given to Jacob now. And like I said, it's been 20 years later. He's got a family and wealth. And in verse 1, it says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which means 2 camps or 2 groups of folks. And what we have here is when Jacob comes back into the land, just as when he left, he sees God's angels there. So remember Genesis 28, as he was leaving Israel, he was at Bethel, he saw this vision of angels. He says, this is God's house. Comes back into the land, and who's there to greet him? God's angels. And so this is multiple times Jacob seeing angels. We'll see even in the future in Genesis, angels surround Israel, and specifically Jacob in his life, protecting him from those in the land. Because God knows that now that they're growing, especially as a family and as a nation eventually, they're living in a land of strangers, okay? And so as they're strangers in this land, they need God's protection from those in the land. And so the angels are there, and they welcome him back. And it says in verse 3, Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. We covered before, of course, that Edom was a name given to Esau, so that he actually had, in the last 20 years, left and started a nation over there. He started a family, and that's the land now, the country of Edom, the land of Seir, which Esau has been populating. We'll cover in a couple chapters how Esau's family has grown, probably larger than Jacob's, and his wealth is probably larger than Jacob's as well. And Jacob said, well, now I'm back into the land. I'm going to run into Esau eventually. Jacob initiates the contact and says, I'm going to go meet him. And so he sends some messengers out. In verse 4, he commanded them, saying, thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau, thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and asses and flocks and men servants and women servants. And I have sent to tell my lord that I may find grace in thy sight. So there's something interesting about these 2 verses here, because it's a total change in Jacob's perspective. When he was younger, back when he was in the land before, by himself, without wives and children, we saw the only account of Jacob was him trying to usurp his brother's blessing, usurp his brother's birthright. Because of the prophecy before they were born that God had said the elders should serve the younger, Jacob looked like, he seemed to act like that it was his right to take it. And so apart from waiting for God to make that happen or just waiting for things to play out, he used deceit, and he bought his birthright from Esau, and all sorts of those things happened back there in Genesis 25 through 27. But now, Jacob, rather than trying to claim his right as the one God said, you should serve me, because that's what God said would happen before we were born, he here sends messengers out and calls Esau his Lord. He is his older brother, after all. And then he says, I'm your servant. Okay, again, a position of humility here. Very different than the Jacob we knew chapters ago. Okay, so time has gone. He has learned some lessons back when he lived with Laban, and he's going to learn some more lessons in the next couple of chapters here. But it's interesting here. He says that Esau is Lord. You're going to speak unto my Lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith this, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. And then he says at the end of verse 5, and he's seeking here, I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find grace in thy sight. So the message is, I'm home. He doesn't try to hide that he's back in the land, which he very well could. Esau would have known he was there. He could have just kind of hid out. But instead, he addresses the problem. And so Warren Wiersbe says in his commentary that men like to forget their sins, but their sins often don't forget them. They'll come back to haunt you, as the saying says, right? And so the idea that Jacob could have stayed out of the land and lived just fine somewhere else, his obedience to God required him to come back, and more so than that, required his reconciliation with his brother, okay, because of his wrongdoing, because of what he did to Esau. And so he initiates that. And he says, I'm trying to find grace in your sight, so I'm telling you I'm back. I want to find grace. Now, this is the first time that word grace shows up in the Bible since Lot. This is the third time the word shows up in the Bible. The first time was with Noah, when Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord for the destruction of the earth. The second time was with Lot, as he was fleeing from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He finds grace in the eyes of the angels there protecting him, again, amidst destruction. And then this third time here, Jacob comes back to the land fearing he's going to be destroyed by his brother Esau, because that's what happened when he was leaving, was that threat. And so he's seeking to find grace so that it doesn't happen. Okay, it's the third time. By the way, I'm put on your outline there, over the next 2 chapters, as we deal with their reconciliation, Jacob calls Esau his Lord 8 times. He says 4 times that he's his servant. And he uses that word grace 5 times in the next 2 chapters, which is the most that the word grace is used in any one portion of the Old Testament. Okay? We covered before, in the Old Testament, the 43 books of the Old Testament, which I include there, the 39 of our published Old Testament, and the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's only about 41 instances, so less than 1 per book of the word grace. Okay? The book of Genesis has the most, I think about 12 or 13 instances of the word grace, and 4 of those are in these 2 chapters with Jacob. Okay? Trying to seek reconciliation with his brother Esau. He's trying to find grace from Esau because he doesn't deserve it. Jacob does not deserve anything that Esau would do to bless him, you say, or anything like that. So that's why it's being used here. So we're going to see in the next couple of chapters, and also in chapter 34, this lesson of grace. Because he wronged Esau, you see. No matter what the prophecy of God was, he did wrong to his brother. And so where was the justification for that? Where was the justice there? And so there's nothing worthy about Jacob in the eyes of his brother. And so we're going to see what the response is of Esau here. And so down in verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to thy brother Esau, and also he comes to meet thee, and 400 men with him. So he hears about his coming to meet him, and we don't know why he's coming to meet him in the verse. It doesn't say he's coming to fight with you, or he's coming to, hug you and kiss you. We don't see it here. The messengers say he's coming. We went and told him, and now he's coming with 400 men. Jacob fears the worst, of course. 400 men could outfight his group, his band, although he does have the angels of God's host there, not only to welcome him, but also for his protection, knowing, of course, God has a promise on this man, right? And so, worst case scenario, angels are going to deal with it, because Jacob's got to survive. His family has got to persist, right? That was God's promise. And yet, Jacob doesn't know what intent, what motive, what thoughts Esau has. So in verse 7, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 bands, and said, If Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. So his idea was, I'll split what I got into 2, and that way there'll be one that can be protected at least, that will survive. And it says in verse 8, or verse 9 rather, Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham." So we have in the next three verses, 9 through 12, the first time we read Jacob praying. Jacob has been in Genesis dealing with God, or God with him, for many chapters now, and this is the first time we read Jacob praying to him. We've seen God blessing Jacob. We've seen Jacob seeing visions. We've seen angels speaking to Jacob, telling him what to do with Laban and the flock, right, and telling him to come back. But this is the first time we see Jacob praying, and it's one of the longest prayers in Genesis 32. And again, notice the change in mind from Jacob in Genesis 32, from Jacob back when he deceived his brother. Okay, so quick to usurp what was rightfully his brother's. In Genesis 32, verse 9, he says, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac." He leaves his name out. He doesn't say, "You're my God as well." He's the God of his fathers, because he's going to say, "I'm not worthy of it." He says, "The Lord which says unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, I will deal well with thee." That's a quote from Genesis 31 that he's talking about the God who sent me back here. In verse 10, "I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant." Interesting here, the first prayer we see from Jacob, we show a change, because before, where he thought he could trick his father and thought that he could properly, and we saw him successfully do it, buy the birthright of his brother, right? Now suddenly he says, "I'm not worthy. I am not worthy of the mercies you show me and the truth you revealed to me." That's a change, a spiritual change in his mind. We saw part of that change happen in Genesis 28 when he saw that he was standing in the house of God at Bethel. We saw some more change back with Laban when we saw him grow a little bit there, and how God was speaking to him in Genesis 31. And here again in Genesis 32, we see evidence of his changed attitude towards God, and how he responds to him. He says he's his servant. Okay, Jacob says, "I am not worthy." There's only 3 people in the Bible that says this. Jacob's one, the only person in the whole Old Testament part of your Bible. John the Baptist is another. When he's talking about Jesus, says, "I'm not worthy to latch his shoes." And then you've got the centurion in Jesus' ministry. And he tells Jesus, "I'm not worthy for you to come under my house." And he believes he's the Messiah anyway, and because of that faith, Jesus heals this centurion's servant from a distance. And so Jacob here says, "I am not worthy." This, of course, is a position that we should all take, not being worthy of what God has done for us. Right? We learn that by God's grace revealed to Paul, because he teaches where there's none righteous, no, not one. And we're all sinners, and God commended his love toward us, that while we were still sinners, yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so we also have that position, that we are not worthy. And so again, you see the understanding that Jacob has at such an early point in the Bible, without the rest of the revelation, that he's not worthy of the mercies God showed him when he was fleeing for his life, and yet God gave him a vision of the truth. So there's both mercy there and revelation of the truth, which was nothing that Jacob deserved. And he says in verse 10, "For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I'm become 2 bands." Remember when he left Jordan the first time to go to Laban, it was just him and his staff. He's coming back now, crossing the same river, and he's got this whole family. He's got 2 bands of people in wealth. He says, "Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother with the children." Some people, and we'll get to this a little bit later as well, some people read Genesis 32 and 33 and look at Jacob, knowing the errors that he made in the past. Remember in Genesis 27, there was nothing anybody did good in that chapter. And they want to blame Jacob here for a lack of faith, not believing God. In fact, we've seen from every patriarch in Israel failures of faith, it seems like, where it seems like they're not trusting God entirely. By the end of their life, of course, all of them seem to return to a position of strengthened faith. Abraham, we saw him there learning and him trying to, through Hagar, produce the promise. And yet by the end of his life, he's faithful to God, knowing and willing to sacrifice his son. Isaac the same way. Or even though God ordained his wife, we see in Genesis 27, there's nothing righteous there about what Isaac's doing, trying to give the blessing to his son Esau. But we saw during that whole scenario that Isaac learned and he feared God, and that he blessed both sons because of his faith in God. And here's the same with Jacob, where we saw Jacob early in his life deceptive. We saw Jacob at the well in the last lesson trying to win Rebekah because of her looks and by his strength, by his impressing her, and not waiting on the Lord or asking for the Lord, praying to the Lord for anything. And yet here, as Jacob moves through his life, he's learning things about his position, that he is not worthy of all these things God's given him. And so he says, deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of thy brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me. This is not Jacob with a lack of faith, okay? The faithful man prays to God. The faithful man realizes that he's not worthy and needs God to help him, okay? The faithful man also, as we'll cover later, does not presume what God's going to do. A lot of commentators read this and say, well, he's just not being faithful. He's praying to God because he's afraid. Why should he be afraid? God promised to protect him, right? Well, God didn't tell him how. And we are afraid. People fear. That's a natural course of human events, especially in the face of evil. And yes, we need to trust the Lord. And David writes in the Psalms, we trust the Lord so we don't fear. We're not afraid. We know 1 John, perfect love casts out fear, right? But who among us is perfect, right? Again, none of us are worthy. And who was in the garden, kneeling down, sweating drops of blood, praying to God the Father because of the sorrow and grief he felt of the events coming forward in his life? That was Lord Jesus Christ himself. As he put on flesh, he experienced those things in humanity, the weaknesses. You know, he had to face death. And the same thing here with Jacob. So just because you're afraid does not mean that you should not be, or you're not in a place of reliance on God, of being spiritual and trusting God. And this is what Jacob's doing here the first time praying this prayer of his humility. And down in verse 12, thou hast said, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Did I skip a verse there? Nope, I didn't. And so he's praying to God the promises that he made, which is a good example for anybody praying. They pray what God is doing. Right? God promised Jacob these things. You said that I will do thee good. And so he's praying for deliverance from God based on that. Okay. So we have in verse 13, he lodged there that same night and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother, 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 kine is cows, and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses and 10 foals. And he delivered them into the hand of his servants, every drove by themselves, and said to his servants, pass over before me, and put a space betwixt drove and drove. His plan here is that he's going to take this large gift, and it is a big gift, of the wealth that he has, these animals. He's going to send them with his servants ahead of him to Esau. So as Esau comes, these people are going to come group by group, like a parade. And they're going to meet Esau. And when Esau sees them, in verse 17, he says, this is what you're going to tell him. When Esau, my brother, meets thee and asks thee, whose art thou? You know, who do you belong to? Whose are these? And where do you go? And whose are these before thee? Then thou shalt say, they be thy servants, Jacob. So again, your servant Esau, your servant Jacob's, your brother, but your servants. It is a present sent unto my lord Esau. Again, there's the instance of the Lord. And behold, also he is behind us. And so the message is not that they're your servant Jacob's, they're yours, Lord Esau, but also that Jacob's coming. It's not that he's afraid to approach you, that he's not going to, okay? So he's afraid, but he's got the courage, he's going to meet him, but he's coming behind. So Jacob's plan is that he's going to appease Esau, try to assuage any wrath that he has with these gifts. Again, we have amazingly, in a lot of the commentaries, they'll say that this is Jacob's lack of faith. He just prayed to God to deliver him. Doesn't he trust God to do it? Right? Well, that doesn't mean that you're not prudent in the way that you go. And just because God would keep his promise doesn't mean he would not do it by slaughtering his brother. I mean, we already saw angels there, right? What if Esau came upon Jacob with wrath and God had to keep his promise? There'd be a bad outcome. And so Jacob here is trying to pursue peace, not just what's right, but peace with it. And so you see him reaching out here to Esau with his own grace. And so in verse 19, so he commanded the second and the third and all that followed the drove, saying, on this manner shall you speak unto Esau. And so verse 20, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me, and afterward I will see his face, peradventure he will accept of me. So his goal in praying and sending the messengers and sending the gift is so that Esau and him can be reunited. Okay? He could have just walked up to Esau, trusting fully in God's promise, right? And discounting the fact that Esau could still be motivated by fear. by wrath, rather by anger, okay? But instead, he takes care to try to alleviate that situation by him showing grace. Verse 21, so went the president over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company. And he rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants and 11 sons, and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent them over that he had. So he sends them over the river as a means of protection, because he sends the servants first with his animals, and his family kind of stays behind. He's left alone by this time, because he sent his family across the river. In verse 24, Jacob's left alone, and there he wrestles with God. He says in verse 24, he wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. And Jacob said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And then the man said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And the man said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And then Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And so there's the story that you may have all heard about Jacob wrestling with God. This, of course, is God in the form of a man. It says a man in verse 24. Later, Jacob recognizes it was God. He doesn't tell him his name for that reason. And, of course, every time we see God appear to people in the Old Testament, we know that that's Jesus Christ. No man can see God the Father except through Jesus Christ. And so it's what the theologians call a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord. He's not truly a man, not born of a woman. It's an appearance of a man. And so he appeared to Abraham, he appeared to Isaac, he appears here to Jacob, wrestling with him. You say, why is God wrestling with him? And if God's wrestling, why is he losing? Right? But it's to teach him a lesson. This isn't just an accident where God's moseying around and Jacob, catches him and they start fighting. It's to teach Jacob this principle that Jacob had his problem in his youth was trusting his own intelligence, trusting his own strength. Remember when he went to Laban, what did he do to impress Rebekah? He took that stone off the well, right? He's a strong man. Jacob is a strong physical man. And because of that, he was able to work for Laban for 7 years. A weaker man would not have been able to do that, but he had that strength, and Laban liked his strength, and that's why he was so prosperous with Laban. And so he's a strong man, trusting in his own ability to supplant, right? To achieve things by his own intelligence or by his own scheming, and yet here God's teaching him that you're not going to be able to do this on your own. In fact, you're not going to be able to do it by your strength at all. It's going to be me that is your strength. And of course, we've already seen Jacob admitting to God that I'm not worthy, right? We've already seen him try to make the situation of reuniting Esau a little easier by presenting presents of his wealth. But God's going to drive that lesson home that it's not going to be you, Jacob. It's not going to be your strength. In fact, he's going to cripple him here. And in verse 31 and 32 rather, it says he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. God touched the hollow of his thigh when they were wrestling. It says in verse 25, when he saw that he prevailed not, when God, as the form of man, saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and he knocked it out of joint. Okay? Which again shows that God was allowing him to prevail, you see. I mean, God is God, right? He could just wipe this guy off. And so just touching his joint knocks his hip, knocks it out of joint, the hollow of his thigh. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. And this is the test. When Jacob does not let him go, he doesn't let him go. He's looking for a blessing. The reason why they were wrestling is Jacob is looking for a blessing from this man. Okay? And what the response is that I'm going to change your name. And he changes his name only when he's crippled and only when he's seeking and clinging and crying out to God here for a blessing. I need your blessing, Jacob says. Okay? He's not trying to beat him. He's trying to get a blessing from him. And so that's when his name is changed to Israel. Okay? And so this wrestling here that Jacob has overnight, I've already mentioned to you the wrestling that Jesus did in prayer with God in Luke 22:41. Jesus stayed up all night praying to God in Luke chapter 6. In Luke 22, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's there most of the night. Not all night because Judas comes, But he's there in pain, in sorrow, wrestling with this thing that's going to happen with God. And Jesus, of course, prays, thy will be done, not mine. And so the attitude that we need to trust God's will, know what God's will is, but also realize it's not by our own strength that things get accomplished, is what he's trying to teach Jacob here. Okay, God's lesson to show Jacob his strength is not in his flesh, but in his clinging to God in his weakness. And that's when God blesses him. God could have blessed him the first time he laid hands on him. Look, you got me, Jacob. I'll bless you. They wrestled all night. And then at the end of the night, he cripples Jacob. And Jacob continues to cling on to him, even though he cannot win after this. And it's in his weakness he gets blessed. Okay. Israel, of course, is the name that he's given in verse 28. Israel, it says, as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Jacob does not prevail because of his physical strength, because at this point, his thigh is out of joint. He's prevailing because he's persistent in asking for this blessing. Okay. And so Israel here is a prince and a power with God. The power he has with God is the promise. The power he has with God is that God's going to bless him. He has power with men, and so he's going to prevail. And Jacob asked him and said, what is your name? And so when God asked Jacob his name, let's turn back to Genesis 27. I want to show you something here. Genesis 27. Genesis 27, verse 36. Let's back up, to, not verse 36, but way back up to 19, 18:19. When Jacob, back in Genesis 27, was here in the deception, trying to get the first blessing of his father. He comes into the tent. He's dressed, of course, like Esau. He's got, remember, the goat skins on him. Rebekah, his mother, dressed him up like this. In verse 18, he came to his father and said, my father. And he said, here am I. Who art thou, my son? Okay, so he's asking, who are you? What's your name? This is the last time in the Bible someone asked Jacob his name. It's right here in Genesis 27. And what's Jacob respond? I'm Esau. He lies, right? Okay. Drop down to verse 36 in Genesis 27. When Esau finds out, when Isaac and Esau both find out that Jacob had lied, in verse 36, Esau said, is not he rightly named Jacob? What does the name Jacob mean? Remember, we covered that when they were born. His name was Jacob because it meant heel grabber or supplanter, right? He was the one that was going to hang on and take what, by his strength, what was in front of him. In verse 36, he's not right. Is he not rightly called Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he takes away my blessing. And he said, hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? And Esau, of course, cries out here for another blessing. And so you see his name being rightly called Jacob before. Okay. In Genesis chapter 32, when he wrestles with God here, God asks him his name, not because he doesn't know it. He's not saying, well, who are you anyway? I'm going to sign you up for my wrestling team. He says, who are you? And he says, Jacob. Okay, because that's what his dad asked him, and he said Esau before. And Esau said he's rightly called Jacob, a supplanter, a deceiver. He takes things, right? But God says, no, it's no more Jacob. Now it's Israel. Because he's changed. He's gone through a transformation spiritually. Trusting God, knowing God's truth, being the inheritor of God's promise. His name is Israel because he has power with God by his prayer, right? I'm not worthy, he says, but you've given me this mercy and truth. That's the strength that we have. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11 that his strength is in his weakness. And isn't that what we learn by grace? Is that when Paul requested the Lord 3 times, thrice, to remove the thorn in his flesh, God says, my grace is sufficient for thee. And so Paul realizes that in my weakness, Christ is made strong. It's the same thing. In Jacob's weakness here, he knows that God is the one that's going to give him the promise. He's the one that named him Israel because he has power with God. Where does his power with God come from? Is he such a spiritual giant? He just prayed, I'm not worthy. No, his power with God comes because God gave him a promise, right? And so he has power with God, and with men he called him Israel. And that's something Israel needs to remember. If you look at Hosea chapter 12, Hosea chapter 12. This is after Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. this event is brought back up in Israel's future when they're in a similar situation. Israel had done wrong to God, to other people, and they're being faced with the fear of being taken over, overwhelmed, overcome. And in Hosea chapter 12 in verse 3 and 4, Hosea brings up what they should be doing. They should not be, which is what they were doing, going to their enemies to try to get military support for themselves, which is what they did many times. They come in with their enemies in order to defend themselves. They should have been trusting in the God of Israel. But Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3 said, or verse 2, the Lord also hath a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his doings will he recompense him. And so if Israel's disobeyed God, God's going to punish him. He took his brother by the heel in the womb, and by his strength he had power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel, and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. He found him in Bethel, and there he spake with us. So you see in verse 4 there, how he prevailed over the angel is when he wept and made supplication. That's when he prevailed. Up until then, he was just fighting this physical battle, and God disjointed his thigh, right? Is when he was weeping and making supplication, give me a blessing, hanging on to him, right? Wouldn't let him go. That's what Israel needs to do in Hosea 12. They need to turn to God and say, we can't do it. We're not worthy. We need your help. We need you to step in. Look at Hosea 14 in verse 1 and 2. Hosea says, O Israel, return unto the Lord thy God, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. Take with you words, and turn to the Lord, and say unto him, take away all iniquity, and receive us graciously. So will you render the calves of our lips. That's what Israel needed to do with God. They needed to say, we're sinners. We're not worthy. We need you to do it for us by your grace. And Jacob back there, who's in a position where God's told him to come back to the land. He's facing his brother. He doesn't deserve anything from his brother. He's done his brother wrong. He says, I'm not worthy. And so he's learning in this wrestling with God that it's going to happen by God's grace. God is going to give him the strength to prevail. Okay, he's not going to come from his own strength, from his own thinking his way out, because he won't be able to do it this time. God has pushed Jacob right in front of Esau, and there's no way out. Okay, and so that's what's going on here. And when Jacob wrestles with God, there's a problem, and the problem isn't with Esau. We'll see it. Esau really receives Jacob in Genesis 33. It's with Jacob. It's with him, whether he's going to trust himself or whether he's trusting God. Of course, he passed that test when his leg was disjointed, so God changes his name to Israel. Okay. Let's move on to Genesis 32, down in verse 30 and 31. As he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him. The story here of wrestling all night with God ends with the sun rising and him walking away with a limp because he's been disjointed. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh. So there was a tradition in Israel, they would not eat that part of the animal because of this. Okay, remembrance of this. This also shows you, if we can step back for a moment from the context, in verse 32, the person putting Genesis together tells you something about Israel's tradition when Israel wasn't even a nation yet. So this is somebody putting that in there. So the children of Israel have a tradition, and they put that in there because of what happened here. Okay, so there is an editor, there is Moses, who put these things together and knew things and inserted some of his comments. Okay, chapter 33. Jacob has wrestled with God. He's received a blessing from God. He's prayed to God. He says, I'm not worthy of him. He's called Esau his Lord. He sent Esau these presents. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel, unto the two handmaids. And so he divides all the children up to their mothers. He puts the handmaids and their children foremost. So Bilhah and Zilpah with their children go first. And then Leah and her children come after them. And then Rachel, whom he loved most, right, and her son Joseph come last in the line. So he sets them up and according to his wives and his favoritism there. And he says in verse 3, he passed over before them. So this is not Jacob being a coward. This is not Jacob saying, I'm not going to protect my mother and my wives and their children. In fact, he's doing the opposite. He's trying to make the situation peaceful. Jacob passes before them. So he lines up the women and the children with Rachel in the back. Okay, so here's Rachel back here in the back. Here's Leah, and then you have Zilpah and Bilhah. Jacob goes in front of them. Okay, and he's going to go meet Esau. as Esau comes up. So the first guy Esau is going to see is Jacob. If something's going to happen, it's going to happen to him, and the ladies can leave. You see, that's what the plan is. Before Jacob, of course, you've got drove after drove after drove of his servants with these animals. So Esau's he sees all these animals, over 500 or 600 different animals, and they're all his, given to him by his servant Jacob. Then he sees Jacob, and then he's going to see his wives. So verse 3, he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Okay, so again, the bowing there showing his humility before Esau. But look at verse 4. Look at Esau's response. So here's the moment of truth in the story. How's Esau going to respond to all this? It says, Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they both wept, cried. Reconciliation, reunification here. Okay, Esau apparently the gifts didn't matter. Okay, Esau had already reconciled himself with Jacob and was happy here to see him. This reminds me, I don't know about you, it reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. Remember the prodigal son? A prodigal, of course, means the son, someone who spends lavishly on things they don't really need. And the prodigal son took his inheritance from his father, left and spent all of his money, was poor and poverty-stricken, comes back to his father, and his father runs out to him. You know, and it says the same thing here. He fell on his neck and he kissed him, and that's the same thing the father treated the prodigal son. What's the lesson in the prodigal son's story? Isn't it the grace that the father shows the son, even though the son didn't deserve it? Right? It's the same thing here. Jacob did not deserve it, you see. Esau is showing grace to him. He didn't deserve it. And Esau is saying, welcome home. Welcome home. Okay? Esau's not hating him here. Last time we read of Esau, he was hating Jacob. That's why Jacob left. Now he doesn't. Okay? Verse 5, he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, who are these? So you see here Jacob's first, then he sees the women coming. He says, who are these? And as they come up one by one with their children, he introduces them. And the handmaids, it says, or verse 5 rather, he says, the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. And the handmaidens came near, and they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And afterward Joseph and Rachel. Verse 8, he said, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? So he's like, I came past all these animals. What's that all about? Right? And look what he says again. These are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. Jacob is still showing, I am not worthy, Esau. I did you wrong. You're the Lord here. I'm the servant. They're gifts to you. Okay? Because I don't deserve this grace. Esau says, look what Esau says here. This is the first time you see this in your Bible. Not many people in the Bible have said it. Not many people in history have said this. He says, I have enough. I have enough. I don't need it. I don't need the stuff you're giving me. That's grace. Okay, grace is, I'm receiving you and I don't need anything. I have enough. That's also, by the way, a fulfillment of what Isaac blessed his son with. Isaac blessed both Jacob and Esau, and he blessed them both that they would be prosperous. And here Esau is. He says, I have enough. He says, my brother, keep thou that hast unto thyself. You keep it. Jacob said, nay, I pray thee, if now I found grace in thy sight, there it is again. If I find grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. If truly you were giving me grace, then take it. He says, I don't want it. And then receive my present on my hand, for therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Jacob saw God's face the night before. That's what he said. That's why he called that place Peniel, because he fought with God, he saw his face, and he wasn't consumed. And here he says, I've seen your face as though I had seen the face of God. What does he mean? What lesson did he learn the night before? He needs God's grace. What did he see here with Esau? He just got grace. So he sees in Esau the grace that God gives him as well. He prayed to God, I'm not worthy. He comes to Esau saying, I'm not worthy. And from both of them he sees grace. I see in you the face of God is what he says. Okay, because he sees God's grace there. In verse 11, take, I pray thee, my blessing. This is what Jacob says. Take the blessing, take the present, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. So Jacob responds with, I have enough as well, because God promised and blessed him with wealth. Okay? And so he says, just take it. And he urged him, and he took it. And so Esau takes the gift, and this shows, again, that Esau had no ill intent, that Esau was not angry at Jacob. He had to urge him, and then when he took it, this shows that they've been reconciled. Okay? This is not a show. This is true reconciliation. They were both weeping and hugging each other. And so Esau takes the gift because God was gracious to both of them. And verse 12, he said, let us take our journey together. So Esau says, let's go. Let's just travel along together. I will go before thee. Esau, if you remember, back in Genesis 27, the blessing he was given, the prophecy was given about him was that he would be a people who hunted. He'd be a people who increased, but they'd be hunters, whereas Jacob was going to be a shepherd. And so the way they travel, of course, hunters would go a lot faster than shepherds will. Shepherds have to walk with their sheep, with their flock. They only go as fast as them. Hunters, they're on horses or something. They're going fast, which is why they traveled hundreds of miles to Jacob so quickly. But he says, let's go. I'll go before thee, and you can follow me, and we'll go together. Okay. Jacob says, my Lord knoweth the children are tender, and the flocks and the herds with the young are with me. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. So if we push them too hard, it's not going to work. So he says, let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on softly. He says, you go ahead, and I'll go at my own pace. And so Jacob here, even though they're reconciled, recognizes that we're going different directions. I wanted to make sure we're reconciled, and if I found grace in your sight, he says, let me go on softly. In verse 15, Esau, let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. And he said, what needeth it? Esau was wanting to give something to Jacob here. Again, showing the reconciliation, showing the grace. Let me just leave some people here just to protect you, to be with you. And he says, no, there's no need. Why? What happened at the beginning of chapter 32? God's host was there with him, right? He's got God's promises. He says God's graciously given me all these things. He doesn't need Esau's assistance. And so he's trying the best he can to refuse without sounding ungrateful. And so we're in 15 when he says, what needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of the Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir. Okay? So that's the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau. And we can learn from that how relationships get reconciled. Okay? And the answer, of course, as we're seeing multiple times, is grace. Grace is how that happens. Jacob didn't deserve it. Esau shouldn't have been wanting to kill his brother, even though he was wronged, right? But grace from both sides is what worked. And by the way, grace in relationships, to repair relationships, to keep relationships together, only requires one person to show the grace, even though both should. And in this case, we have an example of both people showing grace. Only takes one for it to work, okay? Esau did not require Jacob give the presents. If Jacob would have went out with nothing, and it was his old self and never said the prayer, Esau would have come and hugged him and kissed him, okay? Because Esau was showing grace to him. Esau was the one wronged, right? So Esau didn't require presents from Jacob, but Jacob didn't presume either that Esau would forgive him. Jacob didn't say, you know what, Esau, you should show me grace, right? Yes, that's the right thing to do, but he didn't presume that. And so Jacob showed Esau grace as well, and bowing down 7 times to him, calling him Lord, and giving him the presents, right? Because he knew he had wronged. Jacob was the one who did the wrong. And so in relationships, here with brothers, there's grudges that happen. There are mistakes and people who get wrong. Grudges should not be harbored. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, you need to take the wrong, especially from your brethren. That's what Paul says. Take the wrong, to forgive. We can forgive, of course, because we have the knowledge of how all of us are forgiven as sinners through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And we need to give grace, which we have as a picture throughout the Bible, but especially in Christ's death on the cross for us while we were yet sinners. And so how do we not harbor the grudge? How do we reconcile relationships that are broken, that have been harmed, that there's been wrongdoing and fault in? We shouldn't ignore the fault, by the way, and say, well, it just never happened, because it does. Grace never ignores the problem, but it does solve the problem, okay? The first step, of course, is remove your pride, and this we saw with Jacob as he became the servant. Even though God had said the elder shall serve the younger, Jacob didn't come along and say, you know what, God said it, so you got to do it, right? He was then trusting God to make that happen. However it was going to, God said it would, we'll keep that in God's hands. Jacob became the servant, and he said to God, I'm not worthy. He said to Esau, I'm not worthy. He removed his pride, okay? So you need to admit your failure, or meet your failure, as Jacob met Esau, right? And realize that Proverbs 13:10 says, only by pride comes contention. Contention only comes by pride. That's what the Bible says. So when there's contention, there is pride. When you're in an argument, there's pride on one side or the other. It's easy to solve. Remove the pride, okay? You remove the pride, become the servant, and the contention ceases. That's what the Bible says. It works every time. It's so hard, though, when you're in the heat of an argument, when you're in the heat of being wronged, or when you're trying to justify yourself for doing wrong. to remove your pride. It's so hard to do that, but that's what you need to do. Remove your pride. Become the servant. Say, I'm not worthy. Okay? Because none of us are. Step number 2 is respect the other one. Again, so hard when you've been wronged. How do I respect this other person when obviously I'm better than them? They've wronged me. There's evidence that I'm better than them. They wronged me. Maybe in this case, yes, they've wronged you, but when will you do wrong? Right? We need to respect the other, esteem them, as Paul says in Philippians 2, better than ourselves. Philippians chapter 2 in verse 3 and 4. Paul says, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Better than themselves, not equal with themselves, you see. Well, you and I are just about the same. No, if you esteem them better, you will reconcile broken relationships. You will cover wrongs. You will be showing grace. You say, well, they're not really better. Esteem them better. Show them respect. Okay? Christ, of course, died for you while you were still a sinner. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 5, charity, the definition of charity, is not puffing yourself up, right? Not seeking your own. Instead of seeking the truth, working in other people. Seeking others' joy. Philippians 2, verse 4, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. He looked on other people's things. And so the first step is remove your pride. Second step is respect the other person. Esteem them better than yourselves. If that happens, there won't be contention. Okay, that is what grace is. Grace is no matter if you've been wronged or you're the wrongdoer, remove your pride and respect the other as better than yourselves. They don't deserve your argumentation. Okay? And that's how reconciliation happens. Jacob could have tried to justify himself. Esau could have tried to justify himself as he came and tried to attack Jacob because he's been wronged. But neither one of them did that. They removed their pride, and they esteemed the other. Jacob bowed down to the dirt. Esau lifted it up and hugged him. Right? They esteemed the other. They were both arguing about, take my present, take my gift. That's what grace looks like. And of course, we need to give grace first. You want to reconcile a relationship, not hold a grudge. Give grace first. You're in an argument, you're in a relationship, it's broken, one person's been wrong, perhaps both of you think you've been wronged in some way. Okay? Give grace first. Be the first to give grace. Be the first to forgive. Don't expect the other one. Even though we're talking about relationship reconciliation, and some people, when you have a problem in a relationship, it's always the other person's fault, right? And so you say, well, they should show me grace. They should forgive me. They should overlook that. Grace doesn't expect anything, you see. Jacob didn't expect Esau to forgive him, right? And we shouldn't expect God to give us grace. He gives us grace. Thank God every day for that. Grace, give grace first. Don't expect it, okay? And so that's how reconciliation occurs. And we see that picture in Genesis 32 and 33 of these two brothers reconciling after the wrongs that were committed 5 chapters earlier, okay? And so in Genesis 33, verse 2, we already covered how Jacob told Esau seeing him was like seeing the face of God because of the grace he was given from him. Genesis 33, down in verse 17. As Esau returns unto the way of Seir, we don't read again about Esau until chapter 36, where it's just a genealogy of Esau's life. But that's the end of Esau. And as we finish up talking about Esau, we need to remember that the last we hear of Esau, and we'll see him again bury his father with Jacob, is that Jacob and Esau are reconciled. When in the Bible, there are books in the Bible, Obadiah and Jeremiah, that talk about God judging and cursing Esau. Those books are not talking about the man Esau in Genesis 33, but the nation from Esau, the Edomites, who would later curse and kill the Israelites, Jacob's children. Okay? The man Esau reconciled with the man Jacob. Okay? So we don't see here any reason for God to hate this man. Okay? It's always the nation in the future. They're reconciled. Whereas God told Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that those who bless you, I will bless. Those who don't bless you, I will, curse, right? Esau here is not cursing Jacob. He's blessing him, right? Showing grace to him. He offered presents, okay, and Jacob refused, knowing he wasn't worthy. And so we see that's where Esau leaves the picture in Genesis. And we need to just keep that in mind, because the reason why it's so important is because we've dealt with before, people say that God arbitrarily chooses people to condemn and other people to save based on Esau is a big deal. Because they read in Romans 9, they read in Malachi 3 that God hated Esau, and they say, well, there wasn't really any reason. He must have just picked it arbitrarily. Well, no, that's not true at all. It was Esau's children, the Edomites, who later would curse Israel and thus reap their consequences. Let's move on to Genesis 33:17. Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built him a house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth, which means booths. And Jacob came to Shalem in the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram and pitched his tent before the city. And so Jacob goes and dwells in Shechem. It says in verse 18, Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem. Shalem means peace. It's the same type of word used in the city Jerusalem, the city of peace. Okay, so Jacob goes and dwells in peace in Shechem. That's what it says in verse 18, which is the land of Canaan. So Jacob arrives home. When he got there, he saw God's hosts. He dealt with the issue of his brother. They've been reconciled, and so he's at peace. He's dwelling now in Succoth and in Shechem, and he's building, what's he say there? He said he built a house there in verse 17. He pitched his tent before the city. In verse 19, he buys a parcel of a field where he spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. He starts buying this land that God promised to him, right? Just like Abraham did. He starts buying this land. He's back home in the land God had promised. This is the very place, by the way, in Shechem that Abraham came. When at first God told Abraham to leave his family and come down to this land. When Abraham arrived at this place, God said, this is the land I'm going to give you. And so when God told Jacob to return to the land, he's back. He's done that. I say that because of what comes up in the next chapter. And again, maybe I just think a little differently. I don't know. You be persuaded in your own mind. People really want to blame Jacob here for mistakes. And I'm not seeing the mistakes in Genesis 33 and 34. Genesis 34 is a horrible chapter dealing with the rape of his daughter Dinah. Okay? And the commentators blame Jacob for that, saying, well, if he wouldn't have stayed in Shechem, it would have went down to Bethel, it never would have happened. Well, what's wrong with Shechem? Shechem is the place where Abraham was at when God said, I'll give you this land. Okay? Jacob wasn't disobedient to God. He was obeying God. That's what we saw in the last chapter, praying to God, saying, I'm not worthy. Right? And receiving grace from Esau and seeing the reconciliation there. But meanwhile, he is there in Shechem. It says in verse 20, he erected there an altar and called it El Elohi Israel, the God of Israel. That's the altar he made in the land of Israel, the land that God promised. Let's cover Genesis 34. We got 4 minutes left, might as well, right? Genesis 34 in verse 1. This whole chapter, I know when I first started studying it, you ask the question, why is it here? Like every chapter, why is this here? Of course, we noticed the last 2 chapters, it talks about Jacob's spiritual growth, his reconciliation with Esau. Chapter 34 here is the story of Dinah, Jacob's daughter through Leah, who is defiled, it says. She's raped by the king of Shechem, or at least his son, the prince of Shechem. And as a result, Jacob's sons go and slay all the men in this city of Shechem. You say, why is this even here? Just this crazy, horrible story. And it's in contrast to the last 2 chapters, where we've been learning about, Jacob's been learning about God's grace, the grace from Esau. And what we learn here is that just because Jacob in his life made mistakes and learned from God these spiritual truths, just because Abraham made mistakes and then learned from God how to trust him and his promise, and Isaac made mistakes but learned to trust God, in every generation they're going to have to learn the same things. And just because Jacob knows about God's grace does not mean his sons do. In Genesis 34, his sons come onto the scene in the book of Genesis as we introduce Joseph and his 12 sons. And they don't show the grace Jacob did. They don't show the grace Esau did. Okay? In fact, they go over and beyond, and because of that, they reap the consequences, just like Jacob did on his sins, and Isaac and Abraham as well. And his sons, we'll cover this here in a moment. Genesis 34, verse 1, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Okay? Why is she going out to see the daughters of the land? The daughters of the land are Canaanites. We don't hear much about Dinah and her personality. I know there's a New York Times best-selling book called The Red Tent, which they've recently made a TV movie out of, talking about this chapter, Dinah. And they turn it into a whole story about Dinah and her personality and her desire. And she really loved this prince, and it really wasn't defilement. It really was Jacob and this whole religion of Christianity that is man-centered that corrupted the story of Dinah and the true love she had for the prince. It's not in the Bible at all. In fact, the book mocks the Bible by taking God's instructions out of the whole thing and blames Jacob for all of it. Okay, Meanwhile, Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. Why? Okay, don't you remember before when Esau went and married the two wives of the land, and it said it grieved Rebekah and Isaac? Back in Genesis 20, was it 26, 25? Right? Why? Why did it grieve them? Because they were not supposed to marry the Canaanites, right? And they were separate from them. And remember Abraham and Lot? And Abraham deferred to Lot, gave him grace, saying, pick whatever land you want. Lot said, I'm going over there to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Abraham said, okay, I'll go this way. And God gave Abraham all the land. But when Lot went to Sodom and Gomorrah, that was the wrong choice, apparently, because he started assimilating with them, right? And he couldn't purify them. And so Lot there and loses his whole family as a result, his daughters, his wife, and everything in that city. And here's Dinah going out to see the daughters of the land. And why is she going by herself? Why aren't her brothers there, which are out in the flock, watching the flock? Why isn't her father there? Why is she going by herself to see the daughters of the land? Something to consider here about Dinah, but we don't read too much about her in the Bible. The issue in chapter 34 is not about Dinah per se. It's about the sons of Jacob. In verse 2, when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her, he lay with her, and he defiled her. So again, some folks want to say, well, actually they fell in love, and it's not a defilement. That's just what Jacob wrote or Moses wrote in the book here, because it's a macho, misogynistic culture, and so they hate women, and so just because this girl fell in love with someone, they want to say, no, that's defilement. Well, I trust the Bible when it says he took her and lay with her and defiled her. It doesn't say here Dinah went and found a husband. It says he took her, laid with her, and defiled her. It's the same thing you read in the rest of the scripture about women getting raped. Okay? In verse 3, his soul clave unto Dinah. So it was after this that the prince fell in love, apparently, with Dinah. And he loved the damsel and spake kindly unto the damsel. And that should have happened first, by the way. Right? Not the other way around. But in verse 4, Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, get me this damsel to wife. You see a little bit of the personality of the prince Shechem here when he says, get me this woman. What? He's just doing everything backwards, isn't he? He should be finding the woman first, then talking kindly to her, then they get married. Instead, it's all backwards, and he's doing it in reverse. But of course, this is a culture and a people in Shechem that have not been, how do you say it? They have fallen away culturally from what God intended. It was Abraham's family. It was Terah's family. Okay, it was Noah's lineage through Shem and that were following God's instructions and whom God blessed. Not the Shechemites, not the Canaanites. Jacob in verse 5 heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. There's a second time that word defile is used. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. Okay? And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out unto Jacob to commune with him. So after the son says, get me this woman, the father says, right on it, son. And he goes out there to see what he can do to obtain this woman for his son that he's now holding captive in his home. Interesting. Verse 7, the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, and they were very wroth, because he had wrought folly in Israel in lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. Okay, so who's been wronged here? Dinah, Jacob and his family, right? Her brothers have been insulted, okay? And so you have here something very wrong. It says it ought not to be done. And who did the wrong? Shechem. So we have a similar situation from Genesis 32 and 33 where the wrongdoer was Jacob here and Esau had been wronged, and we're going to have this confrontation. How is it reconciled in Genesis 32 and 33? Answer, grace. How is it reconciled in Genesis 34? Bloodshed. Different approach. Okay? What we don't see in Genesis 34 is God anywhere. He's not mentioned once. The Lord's not mentioned once in this chapter. God's all over chapter 33 and 32. Okay? We also don't see in chapter 34 much of Jacob. He's there a few times, but we never see Jacob being part of the conspiracy. You say, what conspiracy? Well, let's read through this here in verse 8. Hamor communed with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Okay, it says his soul clave to her. It says he loved her. Right? So this is a love marriage, right? And so in verse 8, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. I pray you give her him to wife. He's even asking. He's not even making a commandment. He says, and make ye marriages with us, you people of Jacob, and give your daughters unto us, and take our daughters unto you. We'll be one people, right? Now, if you've read anything in the law, you know, even the law hasn't been given yet, that's exactly what God told Israel not to do. Deuteronomy 7, verse 3, God told Israel, do not give your daughters to the people of the land, and do not take their daughters unto you as wives. Do not do that. Okay? That was against the law. Of course, the law hadn't been given yet, but this is exactly what Shechem is promoting, is that we don't care who you are, we don't care who your God is. In fact, we have different gods than you, but we want you and us, we're going to be one, right? We'll marry each other. In verse 10, ye shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you, dwell and trade you therein, and get you possessions therein. And Shechem said to her father, so that was all Hamor, that was all the king of the city, right? Come on, let's be one people, let's marry together. Verse 11, Shechem stands up, the boy in love, right? He said unto her father and to her brethren, let me find grace in your eyes. There's that phrase again, right? Let me find grace in your eyes. That's interesting. That's what Jacob said at least 4 times, the last chapter, to Esau, right? Jacob was the one who wronged his brother. Esau had every right to be angry at Jacob. And Jacob said, let me find grace in your eyes. Let me find grace in your eyes. And here's Shechem. Should he have done what he did in verse 2? No. Right? Shouldn't have done it. But that's not the point of the chapter. This is what's going on when he comes and he says, I want her to be my wife. Let me find grace in your eyes. Why does he need to find grace? Because he knows he didn't do it right. He knows he didn't do it right. He should have done it right the first time. He says, let me find grace in your eyes, and what ye shall say unto me, I will give. If they came looking for a fight, Hamor and Shechem would have come with their men to fight Israel for this woman, or just kept her until they came to fight them. But they came to negotiate the marriage, right? In the same way Jacob ran to Laban to negotiate the marriage, an Abraham's servant. And so they started out doing wrong, but now they're seeking for grace. And so he says in verse 12, ask me never so much dowry and gift, and I will give according as ye shall say unto me, give me the damsel to wife. He says there's no amount too much. Of course, this is the man in love. Ecclesiastes says, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, that a man in love will give his whole house. So that's a dangerous thing. And as we see in Shechem here, the same thing. He says, whatever you ask, I'm going to give it to you because I love her this much. All right. We have covered last lesson, by the way, what a dowry was. A dowry was not payment for a woman. A dowry was insurance for the woman. It was so that if the husband failed or was a deadbeat, the woman would have money in order to survive, you see. That's what that was. And so some of that may have gone to the father as the father helped the young lady in her investment for her life in case his son-in-law, her husband, was a deadbeat. That's what a dowry was. And so the husband always had to provide this. Okay? It was insurance for the woman. So that's what he's asking here. He's saying, whatever the dowry is you ask, and a gift. I'll even give you a gift, too, on top of the dowry. I will give according as you shall say unto me. Verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, deceitfully. Notice, Jacob isn't talking at all. The sons here are responding in their anger. Jacob was waiting for the sons. Why? Hamor came out to commune with him. He didn't come to fight. He came to commune. Again, we're not justifying what Shechem did here, but we're looking at the reaction of Jacob's sons. Jacob's sons responded deceitfully. How did they respond deceitfully? They said, because he hath defiled Dinah their sister, they said unto him, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one that is uncircumcised. Now, was that true, number one? Not necessarily. Wasn't necessarily true. If strangers were to be a part of God's covenant, they need to be circumcised. But if Dinah wanted to marry someone else, there was no instruction from God on this. Okay? The law said this shouldn't happen. The law hadn't been given yet. And by the way, the brothers didn't even try to introduce these people to the God of Israel and what he expected them to do. Instead, they said, we just can't do it. There's no way, it's impossible because you defiled her, because we cannot give our sister to one that is uncircumcised, for that were a reproach unto us. But in this we will consent unto you, if you will be as we be, that every male of you be circumcised. Then will we give our daughters unto you. We will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. Now, how is that a lie, you may ask? It sounds like here their sons are trying to evangelize Hamor and Shechem and the whole city of Shechem. And that would be a lie because these people have intent to kill them. The sons of Jacob have no intent of being one people, which could have very well happened. Okay? In fact, they agreed to this deal in verse 17. If you will not hearken unto us to be circumcised, then will we take our daughters and we will take our daughters. Oh, I lost my place here. And we will be gone, verse 17. 18, their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son, and the young man, Shechem, deferred not to do the thing because he had delight in Jacob's daughter. That means he didn't hesitate. Didn't hesitate to be circumcised. Right? So, no doubt, I'll do anything. That's it. I'm going to do it. Great. And so they go back to the city, to the men at the gate of the city, because the condition was that everyone in the city had to be, not just Shechem. Right? So they go back and talk to the men of the city. And verse 21, this is what they say. These men are peaceable with us, therefore let them dwell in the land and trade therein, for the land, behold, it is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us for wives. Let us give them our daughters. Only herein will the men consent unto us. And he says, if every male among us be circumcised, as they are circumcised. Now, notice here the emphasis on the physical circumcision, which is a problem, okay? Because the physical act of circumcision was not why God gave circumcision. It wasn't because I want to cut off the foreskin of your flesh. Remember, it was a token of the covenant, of the promise that God made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that through them there would be a seed of promise, right? A promised nation through birth, right? It had to do with that, serving the God of Israel. In every generation, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they had to learn this lesson from God of how he would provide for them, right? This is not what Jacob's sons are doing here. They're just saying, you know what? Cut off the foreskin of your flesh. Didn't teach them anything about God, didn't tell them about God. They're just saying, be circumcised. They're removing the sacred symbol of circumcision, the token of the faith that they have without being circumcised, right? For these men just being circumcised for the sake of it. This is religion. This is just an act. And that's all Hamor sees. They say, look, this is the only thing they want us to do, circumcised. They don't say anything about and worship his God and follow their customs, right? It's circumcision, that's it. Being circumcised doesn't make you God's servant, right? It doesn't make you part of God's people just by being circumcised. There were more people than Jacob and his family that were circumcised. Remember, Ishmael was circumcised, right? It's not just the circumcision, it's the promise behind it. We don't read that from Jacob's sons here. Of course, that's why they said it deceitfully. They were trying to trick them. They were using circumcision, God's covenant token, as a means of vengeance. Because once they get circumcised, you'll see here that the conspiracy is they're going to kill them. And so in verse 23, notice Horam and Shechem, as they're talking to the men of the city, their justification for being circumcised is that we'll become one people. In verse 23, we'll have part of their possessions. Shall not their cattle and their substance and every beast of theirs be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. And so you see, if we get circumcised, we'll dwell one with another, and we'll have their things. We'll be one. We can have their Dinahs. We can have their money. We can have their cattle. So George Williams, dispensational commentator, said about this verse here, there are many people who will come to church and perform the actions of church in order to reap the profits of things in the church, but not truly be a part of it. Okay, to reap he said the Dinahs and the diamonds. There is such a thing as men going to churches and acting religious to marry good women, right? Men go to churches to pick up women. That happens. And that's what should not happen, but it does. People go to church for many reasons. They have nothing to do with learning about God, doing his will, serving him better. None of that. There's lots of reasons people go to church, and that's the wrong way to do it, you see. It's just a religious act. It's fake. It's a show. And here we see Hamor and Shechem. They know nothing because they haven't been told about the God of Israel. But they're saying, perform this act, and we can have their possessions. We can marry their women. We can be one people. It'll be great. Okay. This, of course, is not the way God would intend it. Either way, you see it. Whether it be the sons of Jacob that are wrong or Shechem that is wrong. And so verse 24 rather, unto Hamor and Shechem his son hearkened all that went out of the gate of a city, and every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of a city. And it came to pass on the third day, when they were sore, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren. Simeon and Levi, of course, were full brothers of Dinah. They had the same mother and the same father. Okay, took each man his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. Now, what did Jesus say about bearing the sword? He lives by the sword, dies by the sword, right? This is the deception. The deception was they never intended to be one people with the Shechemites, right? They were going to kill them. And so when they were restored the third day, they went and slew all the males. They slew Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword. They took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out. Now, those 2 men did that. Then the other 9 brothers, the sons of Jacob, came upon the slain and spoiled the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their sheep, their oxen, their asses, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field. So all the men are dead. They take the women, they take the possessions, and bring them back. In verse 29, all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives took away they captive and spoiled all that was in the house. And Jacob said, and this is the first time we hear Jacob speaking in the whole chapter, to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, amongst the Canaanites and the Perizzites. The sons of Jacob did not show grace to Shechem, who did wrong to their sister, did wrong to the daughter of Jacob. He was looking for grace. They didn't show it. Okay? Instead, they sought revenge, and not just revenge, but an anger that went over and beyond revenge. Okay? They killed all of them. Why did all the men in the city have to die? Why did they destroy the city that way? That's the type of envy, the type of anger that is so counterproductive and contentious to grace. Jacob says, you've troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of the land. Amongst the Canaanites and the Perizzites, I being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed in my house. Again, some commentators say here, well, isn't Jacob so selfish? Look at the word I in that verse there. How much he's worried about himself dying. Doesn't he trust God? Of course he trusts God. But you know what? It doesn't make it any easier when your sons go around killing people. You see, the problem here is not Jacob saying, oh, great, now people are going to be looking to kill me. Because what he said was true. They weren't looking to kill him before, but now they are. Why? Because his sons sinned. His sons had a problem. Of course, his sons respond and say, should he deal with our sister as a harlot? This was justice done today. Was it really justice? Normally, when you seek justice, a lot of the time, especially on your own, with your emotions, it's more revenge, and you take a little bit more than what is really true justice. And a little bit more. They took the whole town, right? Under the law, it could have been punishment to Shechem under Israel's law. Shechem, not his father, not his neighbors, not anyone else in the city. Shechem, right? Shechem came. He was seeking grace. They deceived him, and then they killed him, all of them. Look at Genesis 49, verse 5. Genesis 49, verse 5. Say, how do you know what they did was wrong? I mean, after all, she was raped. They took her. He defiled her, it said 3 times. Yeah, that was wrong. Jacob learned something about how to respond to people who do you wrong. His sons haven't. Genesis 49, verse 5. They'll learn eventually. These same sons who killed the whole city will sell their own brother into slavery. They'll be starving and have to bow down to that brother. They'll learn something about grace as well. But Genesis 49, verse 5, Simeon and Levi here, Jacob's on his deathbed. He's bringing his children and his grandchildren up to bless them and or curse them. There are prophecies about their life. In verse 5, it says, Simeon and Levi are brethren, the 2 men who slew all the males in Shechem. And instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Mine honor, be not thou united with them. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That's the result of what they did in Shechem in Genesis 34. That's the result of their not showing Shechem grace, right? And so that's why Genesis 34 comes after 32 and 33. We learned about grace. Jacob was the wrongdoer, right? Jacob knows what it's like to be the wrongdoer. He sees Shechem. Why was Dinah out? Shechem, you did wrong. He's looking to make it right, and his sons kill them all, right? So you see there the issue in that chapter is about his sons, okay? Romans 12:19 tells us not to seek wrath. Why? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Deuteronomy 22 talks about the law of marriage and how you're supposed to do marriage a certain way, right? And it talks about how you're not supposed to rape women under the law. Contrary to what skeptics say about the Bible honors women. There are things in the Bible that cannot be sold, the truth. Women, they're both highly valued, okay? They're both highly protected in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32 says, vengeance is the Lord's. Don't seek it on your own. And Jacob had learned that. Jacob had learned that because Esau didn't seek it, and he didn't seek it. His sons were trying to put themselves in God's place. If Shechem had done wrong, and God wanted him punished, God would have done it. Okay, God would have instructed his people, Jacob and his family, to do it, and they didn't. God wasn't even in that chapter. It wasn't mentioned once. They didn't stop and pray about it, ask God about it. They just went up and did it deceitfully. And now Israel and the name of God on this people is now shamed, disgraced. People are going to know that, hey, whatever you do, don't get circumcised. It's a trick. They're going to kill you. What? That was supposed to be a symbol of God's covenant. And we see it turned here into barbarism, right? So Genesis 34. We'll pick it up in chapter 35 next week. Any questions? Any comments? All right. Enough said. Lord, we thank you for the lessons that we learn in your word. I pray that we would, have the strength to apply them in our relationships, in our activities, knowing that our flesh is so strong sometimes. Help us to know how to walk in the Spirit, to reckon ourselves indeed dead unto sin, because the lives that we live are no longer our own, but yours, as we're crucified in you. So we thank you again for your grace, for your Son dying on the cross for our sins, and for the folks who come out to meet and learn and grow together about it. Amen. Thank you, folks.